In the 1960s, Ivory Coast began to build a cocoa industry that would become the largest in the world. That dominance sustained an economy that carried the country through nearly 4 decades of prosperity. The Civil War that began in 2002 had its roots, in many ways, in the same resource that launched the early glory years. Our first stop was in Musadugu, a community of about 30,000 people. All but a couple hundred of them are considered foreigners, people who moved here from other parts of the country and were given cocoa farmland by the locals. Over the years, these so-called foreigners have prospered, creating a great deal of friction between the two groups. The locals feel they've been treated unfairly by the new president, Alassane Ouattara, and that former President Laurent Gbagbo, now held in The Hague as an accused war criminal, should be allowed to rule the country again. In nearby San Pedro, we found that the same ethnic divisions held true when we visited Saf Cacao, an Ivorian exporter and refinery, where we met distinct factions of Gbagbo and Ouattara supporters among the manual laborers. The tension doesn't seem to have an impact on the workings of the plant, however, and we were led through both the cargo side and the pristine inner workings of the refinery. Most Ivorian cocoa is shipped out and refined overseas, so Saf Cacao's refinery is both an unusual and hopeful sign. From San Pedro we headed inland, to the part of Ivory Coast that is the heart of its cocoa production and was the most hotly contested during the Civil War. The stories we collected show only troubled, uncertain steps toward reconciliation, as the conflict is still too recent and wounds too fresh. In Pinhu we came across young children training to become the village's next official traditional dancer, since the previous one was killed during last year's post-election violence. In Dwekwe, we met women who had been raped by troops during the fighting. In Nahibli, a displaced person camp outside of Dwekwe, we saw thousands of people that were chased from their homes by the fighting and were now living in rows of canvas tents. That camp was later burned to the ground as a result of continuing political tension in the area, and 4,000 people were once again made homeless. These young men were living in the camp when we visited. They told us how they had escaped fighting in their hometown of Niamble, outside of Dwekwe, only to get caught up in a grisly scene in nearby Carrefour, where troops loyal to Alassane Ouattara allegedly slaughtered hundreds of innocent civilians and piled their bodies into a mass grave. We visited Niamble and saw that the signs of conflict were still very visible a year after the fighting ended. Homes still lay in ruin, and families feared a return to violence. An international aid group organized a reconciliation ceremony in Carrefour while we were there. It was sparsely populated, and a few young men in attendance said they wanted no part of reconciling with the other side. We then traveled to the border with Liberia and caught up with a convoy of refugees who were returning home for the first time in a year. As they headed home, their excitement was mixed with dread, resentment, and anger. Many would be returning to houses that had been reduced to rubble, to communities torn apart by conflict, to cocoa fields taken over by others in their absence. As some began to rebuild, others made promises of bloody revenge. In a village called Zibablo Yeblu, there were signs of continued violence. We met with village officials just a couple of weeks after their village was torched by unknown assailants. "We only started farming cocoa a couple years ago," said one villager. "Now we're worried that the insecurity will continue. They stole our food stock and destroyed our homes. Luckily they fired in the air before setting our homes on fire, so we were able to flee. If they hadn't done that, we'd all be dead. But they're still out there, hiding in the bush."